All right. Well, thanks everybody. I'm hoping this sparks some fun conversation. The title and even more the subtitle is really it's a serious topic, but it's a fun topic and it's a weird time. So I want to present some recent experience with kind of that perspective in mind. I'm going to call this Confessions of a Vibe Coder, but a techno-emotional retrospective. And I think by the end of the talk, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. And so a lot of you don't know me. I infrequent the SEA. I really appreciate what you guys do, but I'm not here every session. So I'll start with a little bit of background. I joined NCAR in 2022. I'm currently the section manager of what we're calling the Consulting and Services Group within CISL and HBCD. I was hired as the group head for consulting services, which is primarily user support, the user software stack on the HPC systems and things of that nature. And then the portfolio has grown, especially over the last year, which is relevant to this project in particular, bringing on some of the software support functions and allocation administration that's been done in CISL as well. This background's really just to kind of give you perspective of how I came into these tools, because I think it might be relevant for some on the call, or I hope anyway. My technical background is a mix of, I'm an HPC user, going way back to grad school days and my previous job at NASA before coming here. I did do application development in the HPC space, primarily high-speed computational fluid dynamics. And then I also have some dated system administration skills, deployed a number of clusters along the way, but that was years back. I have been an open source Linux enthusiast ever since I put Slackware on my laptop in 1996. I don't have as much time for the enthusiasm part anymore right now. It's a full-time job and then some, but I still appreciate open source tools. Now, my preferred development environment is I like to do things locally whenever possible. If I can build it on my laptop, I'm happy, because that means I can work on it on a flight or in a meeting or on the bus or wherever. I'm pretty terminal native and I use Emacs. In fact, I have to tell you, I think I've never once used VS Code. I see the power. I don't grudge anyone who uses it, but I've been doing things this way for so long, I figured I'll stick with that, because if I continuously learn how to do the thing I already know how to do, that doesn't give me a lot of opportunity to learn new stuff, and I love learning new stuff to some extent. My preferred tech stack is really simple. Bash, Git. I love, prefer C++ when compiled languages are required. Python and Make. I'm a container. I use containerization a bit, but try not to overdo it. That can be done for sure. But really what's relevant for today's discussion is I am a mediocre Python programmer. I've got dated skills. I think Python moves so fast. That's fairly common. I have no notable experience with web development or working within databases. I've installed databases for application use, but I've never worked within them until, well, you'll see, October this year, which is not great, because the problem now is we've become increasing stewards of a toolkit we use within CISL called SAM. The System Accounting Manager. This is used within the HPC ecosystem to manage resource allocations. So this is project definitions, members of the projects, things of that nature. And it's been in production for nearly 15 years. It's got several tightly interrelated components. There's a web interface where you can do user and admin functions. There's a whole bunch of back-end processing functions that integrate, daily HPC job usage, storage allocation, things of that nature. There's a web API that serves up information to relevant subsystems. So, our quota system, for example, our batch scheduling system. And then there's a large MySQL database that glues all of this together. It's about 250,000 lines of code. and it uses a whole plethora of frameworks that I'm not familiar with, right? So we've got Java Spring. Hibernate is the object relation manager, the ORM for doing kind of object-oriented coding into that database. And bottom line, a lot of stuff that is a little bit old and not something I was particularly excited about becoming an expert in the year 2025, 2026. But we also rely on this in production. So that kind of started off a rabbit hole. And just to kind of, full self-disclosure, this is how little I knew about databases in October of this year. So that's a screenshot from our internal Slack space. We got HPC read access to this database for some utility functions I'd envisioned, but like, hey, honestly, I have no background in this. Can anybody help me out? So like most people, that probably sent me to a web search, did a lot of browser-based AI queries. So looking at Claude and ChatGPT and all the usual websites, just to, either intentionally or through the Gemini AI assisted search, kind of get sucked into that space relatively quickly. So that persisted for about a week. I then registered with a Claude account, and that was just to get access to the desktop application, which I'll show you why I did that here in just a second. And then I worked in that space for about maybe almost not even quite 2 weeks. And then I personally paid for an annual Claude Pro membership. $200 for a year was the lowest level tier to get access to the command line interface, which I'll show you in a second. And that's kind of when things went off and running. But I'll start with just phase one. So I'm going to play this video, and the slides are linked in the notes. So if this doesn't come through for anybody, feel free to have a look at it afterwards. I'll say that if you've only ever interacted with AI through a browser, at a minimum, I would highly recommend getting the application-specific app. And this is what the desktop app looks like for Claude on my Mac. And the reason for that is, it's a lot easier to work with individual files. In this case, there's my query. I gave it a piece of Python and I wanted it refactored. And so it has refactored it into multiple files. It's defined a project structure that it's suggesting for this particular piece of code. And then I can download those files directly. Still a little bit clunky. There's another feature which which the desktop allows you to do, which is a notion of projects. And projects are kind of self-contained, exactly that, right? Projects, distinct pieces of work that allow you to have co-located chat history and also context. So that's a whole bunch of chats you can see. But then here at the bottom, these are two files which I've uploaded, sammodels.py and then table context. And that's about 6,000 lines combined of Python and just raw text. But in this case, it provides the context for the AI so that my queries are kind of, reference that as additional material. So, think of like RAG, augmented AI searches where it has a persistent memory in references that it can use. And then these chats are kind of self-contained within their own little namespace of sorts. So that's beneficial alone. Most providers have something like this. ChatGPT has an interface through their app. Claude certainly does. And you can usually get this even with the free tier access. I will say it's a little bit of a pain. Manually uploading files is pretty cumbersome and just a giant pain. I will say also, amongst friends here, friends do not let friends use XAI's Grok. I heard this at a CESM forum last week, and I absolutely feel the need to pass it along. I would strongly recommend avoiding that particular company this day and age, since there are other options. We can talk more about that offline or separately if you have any questions for why. So yeah, you can see in this case, like that table context is just a dump of MySQL that I had uploaded. So it gave the bot some context, and then all these conversations are referencing that as background data. So that was just about 2 weeks. And then I quickly stumbled upon the fact that there's a terminal capability. Unfortunately, it's not free. But this is the phase 2, I would say. I call this the awakening. And as I mentioned in the intro, right, like I'm a terminal native person. If I have to run this in VS Code, that's going to be a big barrier for me personally. It's just not, it's a point of friction. So I learned that Claude Code has a native terminal application, and that seemed pretty exciting. But it wasn't free. I decided eventually, after struggling with the app interface for a little bit and the manual uploadings of files, it's like, okay, I'll try this. $200 for the entire year, and that locks me into the Pro plan, which is the minimum tier. And then I could install Claude on my laptop again, right? Like I like doing local dev, so that's where I put it. And I got this terminal capability. And kicked off what I'll call a 6-week technical binge. And I'll show you first a little bit of what the command line agent looks like, and then some of the results of that process. So here's an example, and the fonts are going to be a little bit small. I'll run through this in just a couple minutes, and we can talk about it a little bit later. But if you've never seen the CLI in action, this attempts to show some of the more salient points. I'm starting with 2 files. One is this samples.sh, which I'll show you. It's a shell script that contains some commands that I can run, and I ultimately want the bot to be able to run. So in this case, it's, I don't know, 15 lines of bash. These are scripts that you could run directly from the terminal, and they'll produce some output. But what I want to do is use those commands to form the basis of a new project. And the goals of this project are outlined in the other file, this planning.txt. And it's a little bit small, but it's it's like 5 paragraphs of total text, right? It describes in plain English what I want to do. I want to take these commands, which are, you can reference in the shell script. I want to create a database that captures the output of these commands. I'm specifying the software stack or for consideration, but also asking for suggestions. And then I would like to create a kind of an MVP that uses these commands, puts them in a database, and a process to keep that database synchronized at intervals. So that's my prompt. I take that and I'm going to copy and paste it into Claude. So I'm going to speed this up, and we're not going to watch the whole video. I'll skip ahead and show some relevant points. But I'm firing up Claude at my command line. It's asking if I trust this directory, which I did. I put it in plan mode, and I'm checking the available memory. This becomes habitual if you work in these tools for a little while, because they have a limited working memory, and that's one of the biggest frustrations. I pasted in that prompt, and it's doing its thing. It is now running shell commands within my terminal, within whatever environment I launched it in, and it's prompting me pretty regularly to make sure, hey, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I do that? So it is basically exploring. It's running that shell script. It's capturing the output. It's seeing what's available. It's considering my request. And we're still in planning mode. So what it's doing right now is actually it's coming back and asking a couple clarifying questions, right? Like, what do you want to do in these particular scenarios? And so it asks, I answer, I go through a couple iterations of this. And so here we are, actually about 3 minutes of real time into this process, and it's come back with a plan. So it's devised the plan, it's presenting it, I can review it, I can actually interact with it and edit it. For more complicated projects, what I typically do is I would quit at this point, and I would save that plan to my Git repo, commit it, and I got to be honest, think about it for a day or two, sometimes even more, because I have found very quickly that like interacting with these tools at their natural pace is mentally exhausting. More on that later. But also, you know, it's a complicated process. It's putting forward some plans that I need to critically think about, and I cannot think as fast as it. Coming to grips with that has been a bit of a challenge. So we'll skip through the rest of the planning phase. I iterate, I refine the plan, and then ultimately we get to the part where we're coding. And so it's going to do this. It's going to create a documentation markdown file that describes the database schema. It creates 4 Python files in the working directory and a make file to kind of orchestrate the entire process. So we get to the end, actually run some of these samples. It iterates, right? It's basically as good at native Unix commands as I am, better in most cases. It's funny when it chooses things that different than you would. You have to kind of put ego aside. It's a journey. So it's doing its thing, and then by the time we get to the end, we actually have a minimum viable product for this particular capability. You can see there's a command line utility there with some pretty extensive arguments. It's running it. It's created the database. And then my last step is I'm asking it to git commit on the current branch. And here's a pro tip. When you first fire it up, it's going to be high. It's going to be pretty high on the complimentary and emoji nature. I usually, if I'm starting a new project, tell it to be light on emojis. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with rocket ships and smiley faces everywhere, and I'd prefer not. So you only have to tell it that once or twice per project. It kind of learns your preferences. So that was a whirlwind. We can come back or we can talk about any of that a little bit later. But I really want to, you know, so that's a nice little self-contained project, 13 minutes end to end. And it blows my mind every time I interact with it at that level. So what we did then is technical binge, right? That's what this looks like. Calling this Project Samuel, which is a internal early deployment of an updated version of the SAM project I told you about at the beginning. You know, it was roughly about a 6-week stretch there between through November and into December, where a lot of this initial capability was put into place. There was a lull over the holidays, actually pivoted to a different project. And then now we're ramping up to deploy this on some AWS infrastructure so we can start to get hopefully some early user feedback in the next month or so. I don't really want to go into any more details on the project itself, except to show you kind of a laundry list of new capabilities that were put forward in this time frame. But there was a whole bunch that was done here in a short amount of time. And back more to the point, given my background, right? Like I'm not a web developer. I'm not a database engineer. But the feature complexity enabled, you know, but I am, I would say, you know, an expert system user with some architectural views, but technological, you know, short, you know, like certainly, you know, holes in my tech stack. Combined, this is kind of the progression of features. And this is an eye chart intentionally. I'm not going to read every line here, but part of the point is I'll pick off a couple of these tech stack items. SQL Alchemy, right? That's a Python interface, ORM to SQL itself. That is something I had never used. And it would have taken a better part of a week to get syntactically familiar with it. You know, we had functional products within less than a day working with, you know, something like Claude. Moving down the line, you know, Flask, Marshmallow for the API, PyTest, right? Parallel PyTest is something that, you know, I had never used at a real in-depth. 600 plus unit tests, you know, running in parallel in a couple of minutes. Just amazing kind of how quickly you can make progress with tools that you may be aware of, but don't have anything like an expert or even novice, familiarity working with. So at this stage, there's a web interface proof of concept. There's a pretty extensive CLI available for administrative tasks and some backend processes. And then that's kind of where things, that's where the initial surge took us. That line then is drawn. There was a other project focus going on, and we're coming back now looking at some initial deployments here. And so we're going to deploy this within the UCAR ecosystem. And so hopefully those of you who rely on SAM will get to start playing with this in the next month or so. Now, this isn't really a SAM talk. That's not the point. What I wanted to talk about, though, and maybe spark some conversation is, this was a technical journey, but it was also a pretty significant emotional journey on my part. And I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but we'll hopefully seed some conversation and open it up there in just a second. But like the first question is, where is all this going? This is an article that I pulled from just this week. In Anthropic, they're the ones who make Claude. They looked into their own user data. How are people using the tools? And they compared it to what they assess as kind of like the AI potential of a given domain. They created this radar plot. And I thought it was funny, right? Because they're an AI company, and then a human created this bar chart plot on X, which is, I think, kind of a universal truth that most radar plots can be better represented as stacked bar charts. Maybe the AI doesn't know that yet. But anyway, this is a graphical indication of like how much of different fields could be disrupted by AI. That's the width of the entire bar, versus are currently being disrupted by AI. So that blue is the disruption potential, and the red is Anthropic's estimation of how much of that has actually been realized to date. And, computer and math, that's a pretty broad category, right? I don't know how they estimate 96% of it could be disrupted by AI, but I mean, I think it's fair to say that, it's a very disruptible space. And then based on their, internal usage data, they think that maybe a third of that potential is being realized right now. So where is this going? I don't know. It's hugely disruptive. We are at the beginning of this, and it's crazy. So I kind of want to, I had to remind myself, right? Like when I was first approached with this technology, I reacted with shock, right? It took less than 20 minutes to do something that would take me hours on a good day, with uninterrupted focus time and already being an expert in every piece of the stack. It would take me in several hours to do what this thing can easily do in 20 minutes. But I quickly moved to anger too, right? Like I've been doing open source stuff for 25 years, just putting source code out there, out of benevolence and thinking it's the right thing to do. And then these companies are training these models on this so they can come back and charge us and rip us off. I mean, that's crazy, right? Well, I mean, but if that's where it's going, well, I guess we might as well benefit from this. Can't get left behind. But how much longer until we're all irrelevant, right? Like, I don't know. We're pretty early days, and the capabilities are blowing my mind. And what's the CO2 footprint of all this anyway? It's really hard to quantify that intentionally. These companies treat these operational details as trade secrets. And so it's really hard to get clear information out of that. But how do I define my self-worth honestly in the existence of these tools, right? Like I used to kind of pride myself as a person who could quickly adapt to new technologies and remember random facts. Like where's my value now? And to be honest, right, like the way that these tools are used, they want to maximize your engagement. They throttle you to, depending upon how your access tier or how you purchase them, you may be limited to distinct windows of time where you can use them. So like should I start a session at 10 p.m. to maximize my weekly usage? You know, if I don't maximize each weekly usage, that seems like opportunity missed. So it's been a journey. But at the end of the day, I don't know, right? Like I like writing code, but we do it for a human or a scientific or whatever purpose it is. And if we can do that better or faster, isn't that a good thing? So, I mean, I wanted to put this out here explicitly because I have felt this. I have felt this quite a bit in the past couple months, and I doubt I'm unique, but we can talk about that in a second. I will say another thing that became clear working with LLMs is, as a manager and through previous engineering training, I had a lot of academic knowledge related to cognitive biases. And I really would recommend any curriculum in LLMs eventually include a study in cognitive biases. You know, the availability heuristic or sunk cost fallacy, these terms are mental shortcuts that humans use in decision-making process. And I think I would contend that they have become more relevant than ever, even with working with LLMs in both directions, actually. You know, as a human, I am still inclined to these biases, but there's actually also at least preliminary research that suggests these are baked into the LLMs themselves. The abstract shown at the left is from the medical field, where they're seeing even like extreme prevalence of cognitive biases within early models from the LLM space in diagnosing and medical conditions. And then a more recent article, Computers and Human Behavior, kind of showing the same thing. And I guess the question is, why wouldn't we expect this, right? Like we should. These models are trained to mimic the input-output process that humans have laid forth over the past, written history of the internet. So I think we should expect that they're going to exhibit similar pitfalls as well. I blew past this in the screen demo, but these things can run shell commands on your behalf. That's part of their power. They're expert at it. But don't take that, don't blow past the implications there. There's many versions of this story out there now, right? But in this case, an AI-powered coding agent deleted a company's production database. That one hits kind of close to home because I'm working on a database. I'm doing it on my laptop. I'm doing it with a subsetted local copy in a container, but still, if you give these things great power, of course, what comes with that is great responsibility. So these stories are sadly becoming frequently common. There was a researcher who lost his entire hard drive. But again, right, like, what about backups, right? Like if it weren't for AI, this wouldn't be news. This is just an example, this is a new example of an old problem. And it's just rocketed in frequency and impact with kind of the speed available with these new tools. Same thing at AWS, right? There were some big AWS outages that probably you remember from back in the December timeframe. Just this week, AWS pulled their staff together, and one of the contributing factors was basically generative AI tools being used without adequate safeguards. And so after that outage, Amazon's requiring senior engineers to sign off on AI-assisted changes. And you could actually say, why wasn't that case to begin with, right? Well, I mean, move fast, break things. I guess that's what it's all about. And we're seeing it faster than ever. So where do I stand today? And is there any kind of, how do I interact with these models after, a couple of months, I'd say, in production? And the mental model I tend to operate with is like this one. What would you do if you had an exceptionally knowledgeable but hyperactive intern? They're capable of 1,000 words a minute with perfect syntax, no errors, but they also had no memory, right? Like I say, memory of a goldfish. I know that's that's debated. I'm not a goldfish scientist, but if you have no short-term memory, that's the mental model for working with AI agents, at least at present capacity. So, I mean, here's kind of a list of best practices that I've developed and found documented elsewhere as well. Is definitely start with a clear spec. Put your work into small, well-scoped chunks. Definitely version control. This has made me better at using Git, more rigorous because out of necessity. Write your tests first, or at least at every stage. You add a feature, you need to add a test. And it makes it easier, right? It makes it much easier to write unit testing, especially when you look at, kind of just the minutia of having to write mock input data, right? That's a tedious task. Delegate it to the AI. It's really good at that sort of thing. Verify incrementally. Tell it what not to do, right? Like if you don't want it to introduce a dependency, don't let it. Tell it, restricting yourself to these specific tools, et cetera, that sort of thing. But I also want to stop and just kind of point out that column on the left is very intentionally on the left. Those are good practices regardless, right? This is not an AI specific thing. Those are just kind of the best practices of software engineering that this community, I don't think, would necessarily disagree with, even before these tools. On the right, it's a little bit more AI specific. So the different tools have different ways of doing this. In the case of Claude, it'll look for a Claude.markdown file in your working directory or various other places. You can click on that and look at one from a production example. It's a very detailed instruction set, right? It tells the bot how to run the regression test, project-specific conventions, things of that nature. And it helps a little bit with the goldfish memory problem. It's not perfect. Using the agent for refactoring and mechanical transformations is really good. Like when you can add code this quickly, like very, very quickly, you're going to realize that either the file directory layout or the even variable names are not what maybe ideal. And so those types of transformations are very easy. Give it very specific examples of what you want. I had one rather frustrating experience where I spent a couple hours putting together a new comprehensive data structure. And then the next day, I went to write a utility intending to use that data structure. And, if I was working with a human on this project, I would not have thought it necessary to remind them that data structure we worked on yesterday existed. Well, I got my plan back and I was like, wait a minute. You forgot about that thing we did yesterday? And of course it did, right? I didn't tell it using this data structure, which we wrote yesterday, and it forgot about it. And I was frustrated and I had to fix it, right? That's back to the goldfish memory thing. The context window, I don't have a ton of time. I'm not going to belabor it, but as I showed at the beginning of the screenshot, the working memory of these is precious. It can read entire files, and that can often be very useful. It can also trace patterns through files. And so either of those modes can consume memory in different ways, have different demands. But what you want to do is, you're going to be very cognizant pretty quickly of how much working memory you have access to at one time. And so you're going to, some of the tricks are, I will tell it of a specific variable and it can chase that through multiple files. It doesn't necessarily need to open the entirety of each file. It can just look for the relevant bits of interest. And so there's a lot of those types of things that pop up. And then this last one is, a little bit more specific to the AI usage, is like, don't be afraid to throw things out. Back to those cognitive biases, like it really feels like these models try to save their work or kind of persist with what they can see right now. Sometimes the right answer is just start over, right? Like, especially when you realize that you're paying for the usage, it can be much more, emotionally and financially expensive to dig yourself out of a hole than just to start over. And so that last one too is actually, I think, a side effect that I wasn't prepared for, but I've observed, is I can be much more critical of the code quicker, right? When I used to write code, well, when I still do write code by hand, it's much like writing, a scientific paper or any, prose by hand. I can't objectively edit it immediately, right? Like I write it, I need to let it sit for a while, I need to come back and look at it cold, and then I can objectively edit my own writing. With the AI code, I have no problem being critical immediately. So I don't know, it's just another efficiency. Takeaways, there is no free lunch, right? It turns out that a lot of the best practices for, I guess, vibe coding, I put a line through there, they're the same. Coding is coding. The tools are different. The fundamentals are very similar. But there's no free lunch. We are trading complexity. These tools are not human, but they are trained to mimic human patterns. And that's for good or bad. You have to understand some human pitfalls. They're magnified with these agents. And using and directing AI agents necessarily makes you a manager, unfortunately. And expect continued disruption, right? We're barely a couple of years into this. I don't know where it's going. It's going to be crazy. So I've got a little bit more of that on a single slide. I did want to take 1 second and revisit a little bit more on the emotional aspect of this. There's been studies lately that, supposedly even as people are offloading work to agents, they're working longer hours. People develop AI fatigue. I certainly have experienced this, right? I felt especially in the early weeks of this, anytime I wasn't using the tool felt like a lost opportunity, especially with some of the like hourly pricing models. And I have to come to grips with the fact that it can put things faster than I can digest them, and that's okay. That's why I will, I'll commit a plan and I will sit on it for, in some case, several days, because the worst thing you can do, I think, is ask it to generate code that you don't understand. That is not what this is about. Last bit from this article, it's possible I've overestimated this. I don't consider myself a C-suite type, but I will say I am a manager, right? And this article cut me to the core. When the C-suite starts throwing together prototypes, that might be shifting expectations for everybody else, but it might lead to a inflated understanding of how productive AI is. I did not have the opportunity to throw this task at 3 software developers because I didn't have access to them. It's possible they could have gotten to the same place. I don't know, but I'm feeling that this is pretty disruptive. So with that, I'm gonna stop going full screen, come back and try to see some people, and just kind of, I don't know, Brian, how do you want to go? Anybody have any thoughts, any questions?
Yeah, I would say just, feel free to raise your hand and then go ahead and unmute or put stuff in chat if your mic's not working or something. But looks like Paul, took it.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that something I've recently started doing that I'm not sure how effective it is, but I think maybe it's helping is if I have a complicated problem that I'm passing to the AI, you can kind of do like a pre-pass where you ask the AI to critique like the prompt that you're giving it. And so I did that recently with a script I was writing. I had an idea of what I wanted the script to do, and I told AI, I kind of wrote up, my requirements doc essentially that I was going to get to the AI. And then I thought, hey, I wonder what AI would think of my requirements doc. And so I gave it to it, and it gave me back a more concise requirements doc. And it mentioned, like you said, being specific about things you don't want it to do, and, maybe some features I hadn't thought of and things like that. And so it came back with what I think was a more complete, effective prompt than what I originally had.
Thanks, that's super valuable. I've used them together too. I've had Gemini review Claude's plan, and that's been some effective as well. So it's a brave new world. Seth.
Yeah, really interesting talk. Thanks. Your experience and your background mirrors mine in a lot of ways. So, also Emacs, terminal, that kind of stuff. I have found a couple things. One, I think it's really useful so if you have a paid account with Claude, at least, which is the only one I've used, you have access to preferences, which are just, you can give it directives that apply to every interaction you have. And one of the ones I've found really useful is be briefer. These things will spew out pages and pages and pages of text. And if you tell them to be briefer, one, it's easier to digest the output. And two, it uses less energy, because I inquired about this, and it's output length that really is the big thing that determines how much computation you're using. And there's I think by default they have these system prompts that the companies put into them, which are tuned to encourage you to keep interacting with them. And you can tell them to, hey, don't do that, be brief. They also have a tendency to like ask follow-up questions on everything, and I was annoyed by that. Which brings me to the third thing. It's also really useful to just ask it why it's behaving in a certain way and how you can get it to not do that. Because I said, hey, I feel like when you ask me a follow-up question, you're kind of assigning me homework. Don't do that. What's a good way to express that in my preferences to get you to stop doing that behavior? And it was very effective that way. But generally speaking, I feel like it's important to try to not use an LLM too much. I mean, one, they do have a big energy cost, but two, I think also it's good to, as you say, if it gives you something, if it writes code for you, you should go through that code and try to understand all of it to make sure it's doing what you actually want it to do. But two, it also like keeps your brain working well. So I try to be parsimonious with how much I use it, and not to just talk all day with it and stuff.
100%. A couple quick follow-ups on that. So yeah, the context window and the working memory includes the chat responses, right? So when it has its own big response and you hit enter the next time, that response goes with it. So there's practical and energy reasons to try to keep it brief as well. I have found the only one I've paid for is Claude. I've used ChatGPT, of course, and Gemini a little bit too, and they do seem to all have distinct quote personalities, right? ChatGPT is the worst about congratulatory. You are on the right track. Would you like to end? So that just drives me nuts. Gemini, especially with the new 3 previews, like it seems to be super capable, but very terse. Like it comes back as like, I completed a assigned task. And then you look at the modified codes, aside from putting in trailing white space, which I don't know what's wrong with it there, and not knowing how to escape or quote shell commands. When it works pretty well, but I found it a lot more fragile. One other tip that you made me think about, Seth, is like, yeah, this Claude.md file, like it's own best tool at updating those, right? So especially if I brought on a new capability, or the when the PyTest suite goes from serial to parallel, I ask Claude to update its own instructions, and it's a highly effective way of doing it. Sure, Janine?
Yeah, so going in a little bit different direction, access across the organizations and people paying for it themselves versus the group paying for it. Is there any role for this group to get, NCAR broadly to have accounts? Or I don't even know how that all works. But I hate to see people paying for it privately. It seems like this is helping your work should pay for it. And I think access is a little bit, varied based on what group you're in.
That's for sure. I think I saw Garth at the beginning. Do you want to jump in here, sir, and talk about kind of the ongoing studies of that right now? Or if you had to drop off, I can say that I know INRIT is doing a pilot. When I paid for this $200 out of pocket, it was a bitter pill to swallow, and that gives me a pretty limited tier, right? Like within a 4-hour block, I can only use so much, and within a week, I can only use so much. You can also prepay for kind of API tokens, and those will just run until they run out. In some ways, there's pros and cons to to either model. I believe that right now NRID is doing a kind of an internal pilot study to figure out how to cost this for the model for the organization itself. Brian Dobbins has also got some SEs playing with this and collecting feedback. And even the most right now, the organizational enterprise plans would be like $2,000 a person a year for the highest level of access. And I think we can make the case that the productivity is certainly more than that. But I don't think it's done just yet. Oh, yes, sir. Garth.
Yeah. So thank you. That's all correct, right? Right now, it's just what's the best way for us to utilize this tool across the org in the most cost-effective way. And there are different tiers, as Ben's been describing. One of the tests is with an open router service, which allows you to use a singular API key and access a whole bunch of different ones to figure out what may be best for your particular workflow. For now, until we collect enough data on what we're doing as an organization, and Brian is going to work with the director's office Brian Dobbins to figure out what that looks like, along with Ben and myself and a few other folks. You can send tickets in, and we can help you, just to help at UCAR, figure out what the best tier is. I would not recommend using your own funds for this. Generally, most groups recognize the value in this, even if it's not an organizational push. It is an individual cost center push that we can help navigate for you, give you some of the experience of the lessons we've learned of, the pro doesn't get you very much. You probably need an X5 license if you're going to be serious about Claude or do something. The team gets you only moderately above a certain level. Anyway, we can share those lessons learned and help you navigate the license process. Has to be on a credit card, and we can help with that as well. So stay tuned on that front, but send a ticket in if you're interested, especially if you're purchasing it yourself and can get approval from your group that you want to use it. Fantastic. We can help you work with you to make sure that whole process is as seamless as possible.
I'll address Maria's question real quick from the chat about recommendations for the sandbox. So Claude itself, that edit mode restricts itself to read only, and or plan mode, you can restrict yourself to read only, and I always start there. It's very intrusive about asking for permissions, about running shell commands. Always look at those. It gives you an option to run it kind of free reign. I've never done that. I've also never really found Claude to be error prone. I don't want to like oversell it, but it is very expert with its bash constructs. I do run it locally on my laptop, right? So I generally limit the blast radius that way. My friends on the other end of the backup system are there in case anything melts down. I've never needed it, but I don't usually run this on derecho, but it is possible there as well. Victor.
Yeah, first of all, thanks. This is awesome. I'm really excited that there are others that are using Cloud Code. I started a lot like you did as well last fall and have been using it since. It just keeps getting more and more evolved. I already put in the community or the collaborative notes a mention of the agent teams that they announced last month, in case you haven't seen it, but it can automatically use tmux to start up multiple team members, and I put a screenshot there as well. It looks really cool seeing 4 or 5 of these guys just chugging along, talking to each other, and just creating some really cool output. I did have a question for you. Did you use Opus or Sonnet for your development?
Sonnet for the most part.
Okay.
Yeah. Sonnet.
Yeah, Opus turns to a lot of tokens really fast. I've primarily used Opus myself, and it has some really good output. So I was just wondering. And then one last thing, I actually was another reason why I'm excited about this is I was recently awarded a fellowship for the BSSW. Put the link there in the chat. And so I'm actually going to be working this next, starting April year, for kind of making a framework for agentic engineering, kind of creating standards for scientific engineering to integrate these tools, but make it more reliable, kind of introduce the community to it, have common terminology, and it should be a really fun topic, and I'll have some like workshops and stuff, tutorials to work through. So be on the lookout for that.
Awesome, Victor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I get a thumbs up from anybody if this chart resonated with them? I don't know. Maybe I'm unique, but when I saw these tools, I was just like, oh, I had to go home and I talked to my wife. I was like, I feel like it's a different world, just night and day. Brian.
Yeah, one thing I've been curious about. So, I think a lot of the code that you talk about in this project was at least co-written, if not written directly by the LLM. What's your experience, or anybody else's experience, for how good these models are at ascertaining context? Say, if you want to like use it to help you develop documentation for an existing code base that was written by a human. I assume a lot of that depends on how good the commenting is in the code, but I'm wondering if, like, just based on like the APIs that you're importing and, variable names and things like that, how much it can understand.
I'll say real quick what I did is, so I didn't use Claude for this. I used Gemini because EIT was able to get me hooked up with some org billing. The existing SAM was 250,000 lines of code of stuff I didn't want to become familiar with, right? But I've had it chase variables through that thing, find exactly where this particular email notification is coming from, and I've now developed a project structure of that existing code base, which has helped me tremendously, right? Like, but Ward.
Yeah, so the NetCDF project has some very applicable experience with this as of this week. By and large, good, but it will generate documentation. We actually had a very large pull request submitted that fixed a lot of things, but it still requires a human in the loop. Deep in the guts of this pull request for Doxygen formatted documentation, the pull request fixed some misspellings that were actually there to avoid name collision in the documentation sections. It spent me an hour of my time reviewing this, but it by and large did well, but not well enough that it could be trusted. It was also interesting just to see what would happen. I asked Copilot on GitHub to review it, and it went off the rails immediately. Because the documentation was contained in the source files, it immediately began evaluating the source files as C code instead of evaluating the content of the pull request, which was the documentation. That was my experience yesterday, and yep. Thank you.
All right, Seth. I'm messing up right before the top of the hour, but
yeah, this is not quite the same thing. I mean, I haven't had it like try to tell me what any tremendously complicated code does. I've mostly been using fairly simple code, but I found it is pretty good at Claude. I haven't used the others. Is pretty good at summarizing scientific documents and like what are the big ideas in this paper. And I tested that before I had it summarize some papers I hadn't read for me, I had it summarize some papers I had read and say, are you getting the right big ideas out of this? And I looked at what it came back with me. I'm like, all right, I think you are doing a good job at that. So I think Claude is pretty good at analyzing. Claude has a reputation for being the one that's best at analysis. And that seems to be deserved in my experience, but it still can do dumb things with code. Like I've got a bug that I'm currently fixing right now where it wrote a shell script that is testing for the existence of a file before a few lines later it creates the file. So just because it writes code that is free of syntax errors does not mean it'll write code that is free of logic errors.
100%. I've spent so much time reading code now. Go ahead, Gard. Go.
So this is the sort of tail end of every conversation I seem to have AI is not to be Debbie Downer, right? But the issues that might arise using this, especially in an organization, things like the license contamination or copyleft risk, where you're absorbing GPL licenses and releasing them something else, or uncertainty in provenance when you're pulling code that might have copyright issues and you might not know, or for web application, the security implications of releasing something without actually having a knowledge of what it's doing. So this is an awesome tool, but it's also widely unregulated and just needs some safeguards placed around it. So that's my 30-second spiel on use of these tools.
1000%. There's no free lunch. I will say one thing that we haven't really talked about, but like I would choose Claude today 100%. I also don't think they're going to corner the market forever, right? I don't think there's risk about one company developing complete lock-in, right? The intellectual movement between these companies, you know, the stragglers will look like Claude today in a year, and who knows where Claude will be. I think the economic model is probably more like online music, right? There's going to be 3 or 4 providers that compete rigorously on price. I love Spotify, but if it costs too much, I would use somebody else. And I think that's where these tools are going to go as well, which is maybe a little troubling for the short-term ROI for them for the spending that's going on, but we'll see where that goes. Okay. Next, Cece.
Yeah, hi, Ben. So I just want to echo Maria's earlier comments about the sandbox, and want to discuss about the safety issue, because even with the sandbox, it can create some safety problem. For example, when LLM kept asking for permissions for every tiny bit of actions they take, it can create fatigue of permission fatigue. And whether you have any tips to avoid this kind of fatigue, like if you keep clicking yes, 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 and then you might miss something important, and they do some dumb things that you don't realize that could cause safety issue.
So I've tolerated it for the most part. The things I've thought about, if you're very concerned, right? Like run it with absolute minimum permissions and visibility. And you could even imagine running this inside a container, right? As opposed to on your desktop or anywhere else. And so, you know, on a project or use by use basis, that, you know, if you're until you trust it, and I use trust in air quotes, right? I never fully trust it. But you can, you know, it's kind of like CI/CD, right? Like where do you do that? How do you curl that in to run, in some cases, unknown code, right? Similar risks apply, and it's a spectrum of solutions that are available.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I do have to run to an 11 o'clock, but the conversation doesn't need to stop. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this, though.